On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, France Yellow Vest protests, all about fuel taxes or there's more than meets the eye. And China-US relations at crossroads, two well-respected Chinese scholars present possible solutions. Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. We begin today's program in France, where protesters known as Yellow Vests have effectively forced the French government to make a major concession. Planned increase in fuel tax by a few cents per liter starting next year has been suspended. But the leaderless movement presents deeper and wider resentments in French society. The working class in France, like elsewhere, are trying to say they are hardly getting by, and they believe their president is not on their side. Let's take a look.
France's most violent protests in decades have forced the government to back down. Yellow Vest protesters, angry at the rising cost of fuel, have taken to the streets since mid-November. Now, Prime Minister Edouard Philippe says he wants things to calm down.
Après avoir entendu cette demande exprimée,
after nearly all of the parties that I spoke with during the consultations that I held these last few days made these demands, I am suspending these tax measures.
Edouard Philippe's announcement is a major U-turn, a climb down from what President Emmanuel Macron said only last week.
I will not give in to those who seek destruction and disorder.
But something had to give after the most recent protests on Saturday. The mayor of Paris says $4.5 million worth of damage may have been caused to city infrastructure. And more than 200 petrol stations have run out of fuel due to Yellow Vest blockades at oil refineries.
The French Retail Federation says shops have been heavily affected too. Sales have fallen by over a third, all ahead of the busy Christmas shopping period.
There are still a number of Yellow Vest roadblocks around France. What started off as a protest against fuel tax has morphed into anger at the general cost of living.
I don't think it's sufficient, and I think the government should take a step back and put more on the table.
The Yellow Vest movement has no official leadership, so it's hard to know what concessions will satisfy the diverse group of opinions. With more protests called for this weekend, the government will be waiting anxiously to see if it has offered enough.
So what do the French Yellow Vest protests mean for the country and probably beyond? With us in our Beijing studio, Wang Yiwei, who is the Dean Jean Monnet Chair of a professor and also from the Institute of International Affairs at Renmin University. In Paris, we invited Joe Rouet, the chairman at the Bridge Tank, and also in Paris, Joab Toker, professor at the American Graduate School in Paris, joining us. I want to welcome the three of you, gentlemen, for being with us. Let me start by asking you, Professor Toker, how much do you think this is a retreat by the French government this time?
Very much, very much. We have agglomeration of elements of which we see the relevant ingredients for us to analyze just in a partial way right now, at the moment we are speaking. Of course, the political, economic and fiscal elements which had triggered these 3 weeks of violence and going rain are those related to taxing policies, to gasoline prices. But the nature of the crisis and the modalities through which this crisis is developing as we are talking in present continuous are well beyond, and I would suspect them to be well beyond the fiscal, economic, numerical
then what exactly is it?
We are speaking about rage, we are speaking about anger. It is a combination of long accumulated, how should I say, set of feelings of resentment which have something to do with human respect, with classes and sectors of society, mainly those who are semi-urban or semi-rural, who for a long time now, well before President Macron won the elections a year and a half ago, it's a well-accumulated procedure, have felt that they are in a way distanced away from where real decisions are being taken and real considerations are being addressed to. And
Mr. Rouet, on the other hand, let me ask you as well about
this being expressed.
Let me ask you as well, Mr. Rouet, your thoughts about this. Of course, people feel disadvantaged. The anger and the rage also presented onto the streets. But once the government retreated this time, are we going to see domino effects of further government retreats about some of the directional policies that this administration has been thinking about and advocating? Mr. Rouet.
Yeah, thank you for your question. You know, I would want to say that what the rest of the world sees today is violence and disorder. Now, it might be impressive and images magnify this violence and disorder, but violence is sometimes part of the political process. Fortunately, not every time, but whenever there's an anger, when there's an accumulated lapse of solutions on a growing anger, you would expect violence. So I think on the other hand, what matters, to get back to your question on what we can expect, is whether there is a debate, whether there is a discussion. And I think that unfortunately today, as we speak of today, the summarizing word is cacophony. Cacophony. Everyone speaks, everyone talks aloud, and no one is hearing, no one is listening at the others. We have a prime minister who retrenched, and he said to balance, to patch up, with his retrench, he said that he's heard, that he's listened, that he has understood the anger and etc. But the way the government is communicating, different ministers communicate differently. The people and the workers consider it's not been heard fully, and that there's more a rampant problem. And the government has replied either too late or in a too minimalistic way. It's, I agree, not just a matter of gasoline price, it's a matter of perceived cost of living. And I think that the real debate should be needed where everyone listens to different parties. As of now, we're not there,
Mr. Rouet, therefore, I want to once again ask, because for those, as the Chinese say, in the picture, it's very hard to figure out what exactly the whole picture looks like. And you and Professor Toker are exactly in the picture. But if you go one step further, what exactly is the nature of this debate, or what you call lack of debate? Is it about, directional speaking, where France wants to go in terms of governance, in terms of some of the most important trends about climate change and some of the other issues? Or is it mainly about lack of communication? Because these two are very different from one another. We cannot just mix them up and say there's a problem. Mr. Rouet, very briefly from you.
No, you're absolutely right. There is the background and there is the communication. The problem is that this time the two have intertwined. You know, there's definitely a problem of communication because Emmanuel Macron, the French president, said he wants to be the president of every French person, and he's neither left nor right. Now the problem is that every single French person is either left or right. So there's a problem of communication at the beginning. So either he leaves the communication to his prime minister, and he can be the president of everyone, or he enters into the debate and then he's trapped. And this is what happened. On the background, what matters is the cost of living. Now the cost of living is, we're a rich country, and Europe, generally speaking, has 20 of the 20 out of 30 richest countries in the world. The problem is not so much how much you have on paper. The problem is how much you are left with at the end of the month once every compulsory tax, compulsory expense is paid.
Okay, in that sense,
very, very deep.
I know you can go on, and we are talking to two Frenchmen, right, to say the least. And secondly, you have a lot of passion about what is going on inside the country, certainly a lot to share, but we do want to get some of the most important points out of the ideas. Professor Toker, is France going to change as a result of this setback? Directional in terms of where it is in Europe, where it is on some of the most important and crucial issues in the world, including climate change, including governance. Professor Toker, briefly, if you can.
Yes, I think so. I do not think that the real explanation, the profound explanation for the crisis is directly linked to climate change or even to the purchasing power, and certainly not the price of gasoline. We are speaking about models of political communication, sure enough, as my colleague very rightly emphasized, but beyond communication, it is an overall perception of a long-run type of regime, type of governance, which is not just a list of what kind of measures Parliament votes on and what are the priorities, the formal official priorities of the government. But the way, don't forget, the President Macron, the specificity of President Macron is that he emerged a year and a half ago with a brilliant political analysis regarding the electoral scene, but with very little political experience when it comes to governing. And it may very well be what we're into right now, namely brilliant people, brilliant leaders with long range and far-right ambitions on the European scene as well as on French internal scene and the international arena, and they are blocked by that lack of political experience, namely the way you rightly feel, gather, perceive what real people all over your country feel like.
Professor Wang, it is no surprise that we are seeing a new generation of leaders. You see in major countries around the world that they are new on the international scene. They are new also on their domestic political scene. There seems to be many of them. And therefore, are we going to see a combination of both governance style, lack of experience, but trying to do their best as they see it, with quite an urgent agenda, plus a dramatically changing world? What's going to be the three elements mixed up mean for this leadership?
I think for France, it's go beyond that. The new generation's leader, the French President Macron, is very young, and most importantly, his party is very young. Only 1 year before established, so-called La République en Marche is not traditional strong party. So his way of doing is too sharp, without enough facility, efficient to mobilize the people and make a compromise among different parties. And his ambitions is too big, not domestically to reform the French economy, climate change, to take the leading role, even in the European Union. So social and political support domestically not catch up with. So that's the protest is happening.
In other words, his dream is too big to be realized within the current circumstances. What you're trying to suggest, Professor Wang?
I think the economy problem is the rich and the poor, the gap is still very huge. The French, at the beginning, they cut the tax because of, and people blame him as just for the rich. Then they want to increase the budget for more climate change research, to international, want to make the French voice to be more heard. And then they need to raise the tax. And then that happened.
Mr. Rouet, here's the interesting thing. I mean, on the one hand, France is eager to take the leadership role in terms of some of the most important international issues, particularly climate change. we do not want to forget it is called the Paris Climate Agreement. And secondly, you do see that there is a vacuum, for example, within the European Union, with the current changes going on, and Germany, particularly Angela Merkel, losing out in her party. It seems to be the time for France to step up and play a bigger role. And thirdly, you see during the G20 and some of the other occasions, French president standing up and trying to say, let's make the world work. However, you do see now that he has fire in the backyard. So what does that mean, the internationally ambitious and yet domestically limited president? What's going to be his choice?
Yeah, I'll be very clear and very brief. We have a president, we have a prime minister. The president, and they have different jobs. The president is determined for his reform and for taking the lead. But we have allies. China is an ally of France. China has the China dream. France has the France dream. The coming year is the Sino-French year for energy transition and for ecological civilization. We are determined to contribute into that. This year, the G20 is chaired by Japan in Asia, and by the G7 is chaired by France, and there will be a strong coordination on that. So France is going to play his whole role, and etc. On the domestic side, I think President Macron is learning. He's learning that the role of the president is to be slightly afar from the domestic scene, and that this is the role of the prime minister to do that. Now, the prime minister is experienced. This is the first thing. And the second last thing that I want to say is that despite the parties are young, the solutions are existing in France. Every time we have a major crisis, what we do in France, this was true in '68, this was true in '95, this was true for environment at the beginning of François Hollande's reign, we all sit together and we start listening to each other. There's a word in France for that, it's called a Grenelle. Grenelle is the place where, the name of the street where the discussions and the negotiation after the 1968 crisis were solved. We have a tool, and we are getting close to this tool, I believe.
Professor Wang, we see the retreat on the fuel tax is only one thing, but you also see France is also eager to push some of the other buttons that they consider as important, such as taxing some of the high-tech companies that are operating in Europe. And that will be quite a lead in a way compared to the other countries. Meanwhile, climate change, as we said, with this fuel tax, some of the ideas behind it. And at the same time, France is trying to make what they consider, at least the current administration considers, as the advanced policy in order to indicate its direction of governance. So, Professor, is it too early? Or it's not being done in the right way? If France is facing such situation, does it mean nobody else will step up anymore on these fronts?
I think the President Macron do the right thing. The direction is very, very right. So we just a question about the way of doing is so eager to reach the dreams and the goals. I just come back from Paris, attending the first track to China-French high-level dialogue. There, there's also Senate, the State Secretary of the Climate Change, and the thing about the China and French partnership should move forward. Climate change definitely is the most important of that kind of goal. You know, there's the so-called G2 during Obama administration. China, U.S. cooperation make the climate change deal in Paris, and now because Trump, withdraw the Paris Accord, so President Macron want to hold this flag and then promote the relation between with China, because the French, they're very worried about that the digital economy, AI, France and even Germany, all other European countries lag behind of the US and China. So climate change, I think, is considered about the human civilization. The traditional way of living, producing is unsustainable. Right. So we support that, definitely.
And what does that mean? I mean, if we have seen what we have seen and how the fuel tax is being scrapped off as a result of the protest in the streets, can France partners be confidently work with France on some of these big agendas?
Well, of course, the climate change should pay the costs. You know, the new low carbon economies it's very cost. So we need maybe raise tax from other places, from other areas, not this the oil. Still, we should do that. And China is also very, I think, dramatically changed from the cutting the CO2 emission.
Right.
This way, the France make I think it is possible to cooperate with China.
Professor Toker, your thought as well. The way forward, much challenge ahead.
Oh, much challenge ahead for sure. And don't forget that if we have to contextualize things on both political, economic, and environmental issues, the overall context is full of question marks. Should I mention here the list of question marks regarding what international policies, including environmental ones, are to be concerned due to President Trump's options? Should I mention the instability due to Brexit? Should I mention European instability in terms of what is happening in terms of populist movements in Italy, in Hungary, in Poland, and elsewhere? So Macron, when he was elected a year and a half ago, was perceived, and rightly so, as sort of a source of hope well beyond French borders, in terms of European solidity, in terms of being able to establish something which would be a counterpart to President Trump's bizarreries or strange new elements into the international game. And of course, the fact that he is being weakened now, and perhaps even more than weakened, at least for the a short run, is highly meaningful, well beyond French borders. But we shouldn't exclude also a restabilization of the situation, not tomorrow, not in 1 week, but say in a run, and then things, don't forget that just 3 weeks ago, none of the elements we're talking about today were visible. So I wouldn't exclude a situation in which things would come back to relative rationality in not a very, very long time.
Right. Thank you so much for the three of you gentlemen for helping us understand the real situation. It might make a lot of sense for the headline news that we see the violence in the streets in France. However, it is much more than that, that the thoughts have already been provoked about where is the road ahead for France. Thank you so much, Joab Toker, Joe Rouet, and also Wang Yiwei. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us.